Right now, we have 2 exhibitions in the museum, so I hope you come back when we're open, that are our commemoration to the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, which culminates in August 2020 this year, and why we're doing this really important series on race and suffrage. So the first exhibition, we sort of have part 1 and part 2, is called Why Women Should Vote, and it's based on a 1910 essay that was written by Jane Addams and disseminated widely. You'll see some of these in the exhibition space should you visit. We also are bringing up, we're showing the Illinois impact and how Illinois women had the right to vote 7 years before it was ratified in 1920. So you'll see some of that in the exhibition. And we're also bringing it up to the present, not taking anything for granted in this election year, asking the question, why should women vote today? And to our pleasant surprise, we're receiving hundreds and hundreds of responses. So just to give you a sample, Ross Jordan, who's the curatorial manager here at Hull-House, is going to read you some of those, and we hope that you'll also participate.
So as you're thinking about this, you'll have very quickly the chance to do this yourself. Why women should vote. Women should, in 2020. Why women should vote in 2020? Women should vote. Women should vote women into representative office. Women should vote because all voices deserve to be heard, regardless of gender, race, sexuality, etc. We are all human. Women stand for the values that run society's needs today: compassion, respect, pragmatism, progressivism. We can make a difference in the face of oppressive narcissism, greed, and stagnation. To get a louder voice for us, to erase the institutionalized male privilege that has been speaking for us. Because women are on the front lines of people's caring for others, that are mothers. They are mothers, nurses, housekeepers, waitresses, cooks, social workers, now more than ever physicians. This might have been a physician who wrote this. They know the needs of the people and communities firsthand. Why women should vote in 2020, so our daughters continue our legacy. Why women should vote in 2020. Because women's rights are human rights, queer rights are human rights. I think some of our staff members are going to go out and pass around pencils and some of our why women should vote pages if you want to fill those out during the program tonight. We'll receive them at the end on the way out.
Thank you, Ross. Hopefully you'll feel inspired and contribute your voice. So the part 2 of our exhibition and commemoration is called True Peace, the Presence of Justice. And this is based on a quote from Jane Addams that true peace is not just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice. And it is featuring the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is the longest running women's peace party, and looking at all of their activities and campaigns from then to the present, but also raising the question as to what women's organizing and peace organizing looks like now. So we have some historic pieces in the space that you can enjoy, along with Jane Addams Peace Prize. She was the first American woman, as many of you know, to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for opposing World War I. And around the same time, she has an FBI file that was kept on her. So we juxtapose these to raise questions about why are women so dangerous, and what makes people so dangerous, and who's criminalized now for standing up and speaking out. In the same space, we're working with 2 artists, Monica Trinidad and Sarah G., a printmaker and a photographer who are also activists, who have been documenting many of the activist campaigns in Chicago for the past 10 years. And so you'll see that through their work, many of the hashtag campaigns, photographs by Sarah G. from 10 years of her work. And Also, we just recently added new photographs from her work downstairs in the first floor of the museum last week, which feature the Chicago Teachers Union strike that just happened in 2019 for 11 days. So you can see beautiful photography documentation of that very, very important fight. And this is Monica's work, where she created portraits of activists that she has worked with and who inspired her, and some of the causes that she is connected to, that they are connected to. You can see some of the close detail. Both of their work raise the question of how we make visible these lineages of activism and look at the different connections between different generations. So we started off last year on December and Jane Addams Day with a very important program raising those questions about social justice archiving and documentation of activism in the city beyond, which is mostly led by women of color and queer communities of color. So that brings us today. This is our wonderful series that we have for 2020 called With You or Not at All, that focuses on the history of the role of race in the suffrage movement. The series raises questions about the telling, the obscuring, the archiving, and the commemoration of the histories of the fight to vote. And we are also, again, making connections to the upcoming 2020 election throughout these discussions. With You or Not at All is actually an excerpt from a quote from journalist and anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells when she refused to participate in a segregated national parade in 1913 in Washington, D.C. She said, with you or not at all, I'm not going to participate. So we were very inspired about that, and that sort of is the spirit of our series. This series is a really fantastic partnership between Frances Willard House Museum, Jane Addams Hull-House Museum, and the History Department at Northwestern University in commemoration of the 2020 suffrage centennial. And we have our partners and co-conspirators here today is Lori Osborne here yet? Stuck in traffic. Who is the executive director of the Frances Willard House. Thank you, Lori. And Leslie Harris, we could just stand, who's from Northwestern in the History Department. It's been just really thrilling creating this series with them. Okay, and this is our program today. We have so many people to thank, in addition to our partners I just mentioned. Thanks to all of our speakers for being here today. It's an incredible group, powerful force of speakers you'll hear from soon. I also want to thank UIC's African American Studies Department, that is headed by our moderator, and UIC's African American Cultural and Resource Center, which is headed by Cynthia Blair, for publicizing and sharing and inviting folks to the series. You probably noticed the cameras. I also want to thank CAN TV, who is recording this program, and so you'll be able to see anything that you want to see again online and in some future broadcasts, so watch out for those announcements. I also want to thank our staff. None of this would happen without Hull-House staff, who work extremely hard, and every time I thank them, not many of them are in the room because they're usually working or trying to get something done. So can you all just raise your hand if you're in the room? It's just Ross. Okay. Thank you, Hull-House staff. Okay, and then there's many flyers outside to the other parts of our series. We have Martha Jones coming, who has an incredible new book. We have an event. The next event is on April 30th at Northwestern University, and you'll hear more about that, looking at the divisions along race that happened between Jane Addams, Frances Willard, and Ida B. Wells, which is very, very exciting conversation. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will call up the panel. Very excited to introduce to you Dr. Jane Rhodes, who is the department head and professor of African American Studies here at UIC. She is trained as a mass media historian with specialization in African American history and culture. She focuses on the study of race, gender, and mass media, the history of the Black press, media and social movements, and African American women's history. She is particularly interested in how aggrieved communities have used print culture, film, electronic media, music, and other expressive cultures as modes of resistance and empowerment. Her work also explores the gender politics of African American communities and the experiences of transnational Black subjects. Dr. Rhodes' first book, Mary Ann Shadkari, The Black Press and Protest in the 19th Century, was named the best book in mass communication history by the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. Her second book, Framing the Black Panthers, The Spectacular Rise of a Black Power Icon, was published in fall 2007. She was featured in the award-winning documentary, The Black Press, Soldiers Without Swords, and many, many, many more publications and awards. There was one book that just recently came out. Is this correct? The Rebel Media, is that the most recent one? What's that? In progress. Okay, so this is in progress. Rebel Media Adventures in the History of the Black Public Sphere. And this is where your essay that you sent, is it? No. Okay, all right. Anyway, she's written a lot. Read it all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jane Rhodes. Thank you, Jane.
First of all, it's not about me. I'm just the moderator. So thank you. Back home at Hull-House, where we have so many of our events and build so much community. So I'm so glad all of you are here because we are in the midst of politics, political campaigns. The vote has never been more important than it is right now. And I just taught a course last semester which traced the 100 years of African Americans from 1919 to 2019. And this issue about the vote was stark for my students. When I said to them, can you imagine that 100 years ago women couldn't vote? Can you imagine that the year when my mother was born, 1919, she literally, as a child, did not have the right to vote? And this is something that we have to keep reminding people about, and I'm so glad to have these wonderful speakers helping us sort of trace that history and understand it, and then help us mobilize for the current moment and the current political season. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to tell you the format. So each of our speakers is going to come up, talk, share their work, their ideas, their activism with you, and then we're going to join up here for a conversation. And so please, if you have questions, just get your hand up there. I will make sure to call everybody and have a good, rousing discussion on these critical issues. So our speakers, you can see from the program, so I'm not going to give you their full bios, but Lisa Matterson is our first speaker. She'll be talking about her book on the freedom of her race, Black women and electoral politics in Illinois. So a very important sort of grounded book right here for us in Chicago. She's an associate professor of history at the University of California, Davis. So you now have the distinction of traveling the furthest distance to come talk with us this evening. But also two local writers and activists and thinkers are here to share their work with us. Beverly Cook is a senior archivist at the Vivian Harsh Collection, which is part of the Chicago Public Library System at the Woodson Regional Library. We can't do this work without archivists. You're my hero in many regards. Archivists are doing that important work of collecting and making history visible. So Beverly will be talking to us about her perspectives and her work. And last but certainly not least, Michelle Duster, who not only teaches at Columbia College and has written a number of books and has been in media for 20 years. She's an author, she's a speaker, she's an educator, and last but not least, perhaps, also the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells. She's been on an important campaign, and I'll let her tell you about it, because as we've just heard, Ida B. Wells is such a critical figure in this struggle for social justice and the vote. So first off, Lisa Matterson.
Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's wonderful to have such a warm reception. I'm honored to be part of this event, and it's great to be back in Chicago, which served as a backdrop for my first book. Thank you, Jennifer Scott and Ross Jordan, for all the work that you've put in, and I understand now many more people put into this event. I only have 20 minutes, and so I want to get to it right away by introducing you to someone. And this is Ella Elm. We have no pictures of Elm. She doesn't show up in the census, and this was typical for low-income African Americans. I first encountered Ella Elm in the mid-1990s here in Chicago when I was doing research at the Vivian Harsh Research Collection. And I opened folder 28 of the Illinois Writers Project, and I saw her interview. It was an interview that was done by a Works Progress Administration interviewer, and I can say more about the WPA records in the Q&A if folks are interested. The WPA worker interviewed Elm in her downstate Illinois home in the 1930s. And this is what we can glean from the interview. In 1913, 20-something-year-old Ella Elm, a single black woman, she relocated from Arkansas to Illinois. She was part, of course, of the Great Migration of Southern blacks to the Midwest and the Northeast. Elm had come of age in Arkansas as black men, as white supremacists were disfranchising black men. She arrived in Illinois in 1913 when the state legislature was expanding women's franchise. Elm sought to use her newfound freedoms in Illinois, not only for herself, but for those who she left behind in the South, her family, her friends. Elm's father had certainly prepared her for voting. Elm told the interview, and this is a quote in the interview, quote, "When I was a little girl, my daddy used to say to me, 'Ella, you is a little girl now, but when you grow up to 21 and can vote, don't never vote a Democrat ticket.'" Elm informed the interviewer that she had indeed honored this request. In other words, and I'll say more about this, she was serving as a proxy voter in Illinois for her father in the South and for others in the South who were disfranchised. A side note, it may sound a little odd to 21st century ears what her father said about voting a Republican ticket, and that is because, of course, the majority of African American voters today are Democrats. However, before a major voting realignment in the mid-1930s, the majority of black voters, those who could cast a ballot, did so for the Republican Party. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, anti-slavery, and the Reconstruction Amendments. No more side note. Back to Elm. The stories of women like Elm help us understand the struggle for voting rights among African American women, as well as how their struggle was distinct from the struggle for voting rights among white women, which is a story that is usually more familiar to many people. And I just brought an alphabet soup of organizations that are probably familiar to many of you. These are the kind of genealogy of predominantly white women's suffrage organizations. This narrative typically starts in Seneca Falls in 1848. It runs through all of these organizations, and then it culminates with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Where were black women? Unfortunately, Ella Elm quickly drops from the historical record. But the historical record of other African American women, including migrant women like Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell, just to name two of many. Those, in other words, who have a more complete archival record, these women were consistently involved in these predominantly white women's suffrage organizations. They simultaneously worked with white suffragists to extend voting rights to all American women, and they repeatedly challenged the racism of their white colleagues in these organizations. But African American women also mobilized for suffrage rights through their own organizations. And what I brought here is, it's a list of both national and local organizations. It is sorely incomplete. I just brought a few of the better known national organizations and several local organizations. If I filled this out completely with both, it would be much longer, but I wanted to give you a sense of these organizations. And what you see here are women's reform groups, church groups, fraternal organizations, Republican clubs. Democratic clubs are not included here. I'm going to focus on Republican clubs, but Democratic clubs as well could be included here. And so when we think of the history of women's mobilization for voting rights, we must also include these organizations and, of course, the many more that are not listed here. And with this, I'm here to tell you today that these women, through these organizations, they kept democracy alive, or at least they attempted to, during the years that are known commonly as the nadir of African American history. The nadir denotes the oppressive decades between roughly the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and again roughly a major voting realignment that took place that I mentioned in the 1930s. The period was characterized by the rise in lynchings, legalized segregation, legalized disfranchisement, and I'm moving through this relatively quickly, so I'm not going to talk about how that came about, although I'm certainly happy to do so later on in our program today. White women suffragists did not face a nadir. And this difference made all the difference in shaping black and white women's respective struggles for voting rights. Against the terrible reality of the nadir, African American women labored to obtain voting rights for themselves and for their communities in order to put an end to the nadir. How did they do it? One of the key ways that they did it was by voting. I'm arguing that voting itself was a key suffrage strategy for gaining suffrage and reclaiming suppressed voting rights among African American women. And I covered this in the book. Women in Chicago and Illinois were at the forefront of this strategy of voting to gain suffrage rights. Of course, the argument may seem circular, and so I want to explain what I mean by that. And so I want to return to Elm. In Elm's story, we can see three key components of black women's electoral activism during the nadir. One, we can see that black women's voting in the North was intertwined with struggles against white supremacy in the South. The proxy voting of women like Elm was actually an extension of Southern black women's Reconstruction era mobilization. Reconstruction, I've been throwing this term around a bit. Roughly, it was the period between 1865 and 1877 when rebel states were readmitted to the Union. It was also the period that saw the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, roughly or collectively the 13th, 14th, and 15th, the 13th abolishing slavery, the 14th defining American citizenship as derived from and protected by federal authority, not just local jurisdiction, and the 15th Amendment, which effectively enfranchised African American men. As historian Elsa Barkley Brown has brilliantly documented, African American women in the South who were not entitled to vote were heavily involved in Republican politics during Reconstruction. And I brought an image to exemplify this based on the research of Elsa Barkley Brown. This is a engraving from Harper's Weekly in 1868. You can see it's titled "Electioneering at the South." The caption that accompanies it says, quote, "It shows the newly enfranchised citizens of the United States engaged in a discussion of political questions upon which they are to vote." And the reason why I wanted to show this to you, to draw out this idea of proxy voting, as you can see, there are women and men at this political meeting. And the women, at least when I look at it, if you they're not kind of passively standing by. They're leaning over. And we know from Elsa Barkley Brown's research and others that they are participating in the conversation about what's going on. And she talks about an internal political community versus an external political community. Women were disfranchised in the external, the larger political community. Within the internal political community, they had a vote effectively, in that they expected men to vote on their behalf and behalf of the entire community, and they were willing to ostracize men who did not do so. Two, the second component that I want to emphasize today. In Elm's story, we can also see that while the federal government abandoned American citizens of African descent in the South by Reconstruction in 1877, effectively permitting the nadir to take place, aunts, mothers, sisters, and daughters residing outside the South did not. Subsequent generations, like Elm, kept the battle for black citizenship rights within the party system alive by carrying it in themselves from the North to the South and from the 19th century into the 20th century. One more aside. I want to briefly digress to explain why so many African American women during this period believed in the transformative power of casting a ballot. It was grounded in what historians have called woman's era ideology, the belief that women would lead where men, they argued, had failed in the struggle against white supremacy. And to unpack this woman's era ideology, I want to look at another image. It's a cartoon from the NAACP organ, The Crisis. I thought it was so strong in representing women's era ideology that I made it the cover of the book. This is the original cartoon. In it, you see a woman. She's holding a bat that says Federal Constitution, and the strength of the bat, it's in her hands, it's in her hold, and she is taking on the vultures of segregation, Jim Crow, and the grandfather clause. Behind her are two children, presumably representing the next generation. And then you see in the background a man who is running away, who in this image represents the idea of men's abdication of their responsibilities. And there's a speech balloon, so it's very hard to see, even up close. So let me just read for you what the speech balloon says. I don't believe, this is supposed to be what the man is saying. I don't believe in agitating and fighting. My policy is to pursue the line of least resistance. To hell with citizenship rights. I want money. I think the white folks will let me stay on my land as long as I stay in my place. Shades of Wilmington, North Carolina, which was a massacre of African Americans and essentially a coup in government in 1898. The good whites ain't responsible for bad administration of the law and lynching and peonage. Let me think a while. So a key site of where black women reformers attempted to fulfill this woman's era ideology of bringing the race out of the nadir was through electoral politics. It wasn't the only one, but it was a key one. And this is because even as Southern white supremacists were disfranchising African American men in the South, women's voting rights was expanding in a piecemeal fashion, even before the 19th Amendment. And here are the stages of enfranchisement in Illinois. Women gained the right to vote for school officials in 1891, for some municipal and federal offices in 1913. I think was mentioned earlier. Jane mentioned earlier. And in 1920, we get the 19th Amendment. I want to mention, in bringing up the 19th Amendment here, is that with the enactment of the 19th Amendment, Southern white supremacists moved quickly to disfranchise African American women as well in the South. Women's expanded voting rights in Illinois also coincided with the arrival of tens of thousands of Southern migrants like Ella Elm to the state. In Chicago alone, the black population increased by 1,500% between 1890 and 1930. And in Chicago, this population was concentrated in a relatively compact area, which is really in the middle of Chicago, but it is known as the South Side. It's southern compared to other regions. And it was compact because of restrictive housing covenants and white violence. This meant, politically, that close contests where a victory was determined by a small margin, and there were many contests like this, particularly primaries. Primaries were an essential space where that happened. This voting bloc could make or break a candidate. And women in Chicago, African American women in Chicago, many of them Southern migrants, led the way in canvassing this bloc. Here are two dedicated canvassers that show up in the book, Jenny Lawrence and Ella Berry. And as you can see, there's a lot going on in this slide. But I wanted to share with you kind of the key things to keep in mind. They were both Southern migrants. They both had relocated by the 1910s to the Second Ward. And this list of organizations at the bottom were some of the organizations that I had highlighted in the initial slide. These were the organizations that they were involved in. Again, I'm arguing that these need to be considered as suffrage organizations. By the way, for the freedom of her race is Jenny Lawrence's phrasing. That's what, in one of the documents that I encountered, that's how she described her canvassing, this idea of proxy voting, again, embedded in the title. And this brings me to my final point. The final component of black women's electoral activism during the nadir that I want to bring to the table today. Black women voters were not just canvassers in numbers, they also shaped the content of Midwestern politics. During elections, they repeatedly focused on the Southern violations of Reconstruction and on violations of the 19th Amendment. They did so in two main ways. Strategy one is perhaps obvious, or more obvious, I should say. They mobilized to elect people who would work to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments. One of those was white candidate Ruth Hannah McCormick. I don't have a pointer, so I'll point out some of the other ones, some of the other folks here this way. We see Ella Berry, top left, bottom left, possibly Jenny Lawrence, Mary Church Terrell sitting next to Ruth Hannah McCormick, and Irene McCoy Gaines, who I haven't spoken about, who was the president of the Colored Women's Republican Club of Illinois, one of these important groups. They mobilized for McCormick, and Terrell shows kind of this the national network in which they were operating in. They mobilized because McCormick had promised in her 2 congressional runs, this is a federal office she's running for, to work towards the enforcement of that portion of the 14th Amendment which reduced U.S. House representation in states that disfranchised. The second strategy that they used is that they, and this is one of the most interesting strategies that I encountered doing my research. I didn't recognize it at first until I saw it over and over again. They, in essence, repeatedly look for moments in electoral politics, even small local contests that had nothing to do with federal power, to talk about violations of the Reconstruction Amendments and the 19th Amendment. In other words, if there's no discussion of voting rights, they inserted it. One example comes from 1894, which was the first election in which women in Chicago could vote. And this is the ballot that they were using, and they're voting for only the University of Illinois Board of Trustees. That's the only thing that women were permitted to vote for in that election. But you would think that they were voting for everything, because the rhetoric of these women, and it all shows up in white newspapers, that's the source of their speeches, all they're talking about is the Reconstruction Amendments. All they're talking about is the Reconstruction Amendments. The final example, and this comes from a few decades later, has to do with the 18th Amendment, which was the Prohibition Amendment. And in 1928, there was a debate about repealing, it was ultimately repealing the 18th Amendment. And you can see here Nannie Helen Burroughs, who of course is from Washington, D.C., was one of the leaders in she was a founder in two of these organizations. Americans had never repealed an amendment before. And what Nannie Helen Burroughs and many other women pointed out was that it could threaten the Reconstruction Amendments. In other words, they saw this politics through the lens of citizenship rights, and they brought it into elections. So I have gone over my time just some. Let me come to a close with this presentation. But let me finally say that in my mind, the 19th Amendment centennial is an opportunity to think about our history, and it's very much a moment to think about the contemporary political moment. And so much of what I've seen in the history that I've been describing to you resonates in the contemporary moment. And I look forward to having more conversation about that. So thank you for your attention.
Works for me. Good evening. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Good. Yeah, we'll go. Closer? Okay. I want to thank you for inviting me to come tonight. It's been a long time since I've been to the University of Illinois. My sister and I are alumni, believe it or not, and I don't think we've been back since we graduated. I want to say I appreciate the call. I do not agree with a lot of what's been said, but I think the ladies understand that. I'm always going to fight for your right, for your viewpoint. But when I was first invited, not to this one, but to another talk about the centennial celebration and African American women's involvement in it, they called me it harsh and they wanted images. And I said, for what? And they said, for the African American visual representation of the Seneca Falls. I said, well, you won't find it at harsh. We were not built until 1932. We didn't open until 1932. And so I'm coming from that lens of an archivist whose job it is, frankly, to be objective, to take in collections, to convince you guys to bring me your papers, to process them, and either to do them in a traditional or digitalization, and then to feed the information out to you historians and you writers and you journalists and you filmmakers to tell the story. But from my viewpoint, from reading the Harsh Collection's manuscripts, I did not see the women that you speak of. I'm not saying they did not exist. I'm saying I didn't see them that much in Chicago. Not in the 1840s, not in the 1850s, 60s, or 70s. Round about 1890, I did start seeing them, and that's mostly because I read through those dusty papers of the Illinois Writers Project. And before I run you guys through my PowerPoint, which will mostly talk about my collection and what you guys can do to fulfill this mission of African American suffragists in these collections, whether it's hidden or whether it's the language we use, suffrage versus voting, I'll leave it up to you guys. I found this article in the Illinois Writers Project that I want to read to you. This is 1843 from a paper. And it turns out that the Illinois Senate had just reconvened after swearing in a new group of senators. And one senator there could not pay attention to the swearing in of the office or the things that were on the agenda simply because a man came in carrying wood, and he was black. And of course, from reading it, said this senator was white. And all he could do, his eyes could focus on that and focus on that. So finally, when he got a chance to get up and talk, this is what he said. Mr. Speaker, this legislature, trying to economize a few dollars, has disgraced itself by hiring this nigger to make fires. What, sir, is it that we coming around to? We, sir, this here Senate hire a nigger, this here free state as one of our officers for the toting in of wood and such, and a democratic legislator that we are. Somehow, gentlemen, some gentlemen say he's not a nigger, but sir, the man that don't see the nigger in him sticking out of his hair, or at least his wool, needs some glasses. This was in 1847. I read that to bring to the point that if that was the sentiment in 1847, and Seneca Falls was 1848, most African Americans, men and women, were not really thinking about getting the voting right. They were thinking about getting their rights, and that's one of the issues that we had to deal with today. Black history, or African American history, if you want to be PC, versus women's rights and black men's rights. And somehow we're getting them all mixed up, and they were not the same. And so saying that in, I want to show this PowerPoint presentation about my collection, and saying that maybe there's material in there that the researchers can come in and find, but it is really truly hidden. I don't think it's been hidden on purpose. I think that the writers of the Illinois Writers Project had a mission. They were not dumb people. They were writers and artists and journalists and dramatists in their own rights for that time. They asked very few questions about the voting right. The questions they asked about was equality. How do we get better education for our children? How do we get better housing for our people? How do we get better jobs for our people? Now, somehow voting has been put in this because later on, voting yes did become a tactic of not only the civil rights movement, but the movements before the civil rights to make our life as African American citizens better. And now you got to show me moving forward. These, okay. I start with this one. Somehow I learned how to put some kind of writing in here. Don't ask me how. But I chose this picture because it's on the Negro migration, and it's really about, the Arthur family, and it's not working for me. My sister always says, I have electricity in me, and I just can't work technology. I'm going forward. I'll tell you the story. The Arthur family, which is really interesting. We have to look at a photograph and peel it off layer by layer. Vernon Jarrett, who some of you all may remember as a wonderful journalist, used to come into the Harsh Research Collection because this picture is iconic. It's been used everywhere. If you go to Washington, D.C. today, you see a big floor-to-ceiling model of it. And he wanted to know, who are these people? And we did not know. By the time I came, this in '86, and this is a 1924 picture, he would come into the library and look through the old Chicago Defenders until he found it. It took him, I think it took him about 1.5 years to find it. But it turns out that this is a family that was from Paris, Texas. They owned property. There were about 6 children, but 2 of the older sons had been off fighting a war or something. And when they came back, like anybody that goes off and fights a war and comes back alive, you feel invigorated, you feel like you are powerful, that nothing can harm you. So their father was doing a job for a white family, and the payment was not what they had agreed upon. And so the sons went to correct the situation. Well, you can imagine how that turned out. The sons were beaten, shot, hung, and burned up. 2 of the older sisters, so you can see in this image, saw what was happening and ran like we would to kind of, I don't know, protest or try to help. And these 2 girls were dragged into the sheriff's office and raped, but they were not killed. Ran back home and told the parents, and the whole family left. Now, I don't know how, but somehow the story from Paris, Texas, got to Chicago, Illinois, and they sent money down there, and they brought the family to Chicago. This is a stage photograph. They came here with nothing. Okay, the cooperatives in Chicago dressed them, gave them these empty suitcases, and took a picture, and Abbott was using this picture to say, come north, black folks, there's freedom here. There's a better life here. Okay? You might as well stay up here with me. Okay? The next photograph is Vivian G. Harsh. She is the founder of the Special Negro Collection, of the Harsh Research Collection. Came from an old elite family, settled money. She graduated from Simmons College with a degree in library science, had one job her whole life, the Chicago Public Library. But she was fortunate enough to come under the tutelage or the mentorship of Carter G. Woodson and Dr. George Cleveland Hall, 2 icons who felt that education was important, who felt that you should not only be an educator, you should be an activist. They utilized the word activist before we even got it in the 20th century. And so we see a movement in the Chicago Defender from her being a socialite to a social activist. Okay, this is the first day, opening day of the Chicago Public Library in the Hall branch, George Cleveland Hall at 48th and Michigan. Look how these people are dressed. I don't know whether they're from the South or whether they're from the North. I know most of them are migrants. But the whole idea to the black community at that time, from the Black Belt, because they was all squashed in that area, that there was this full-service library built for their use, staffed by people that looked like them. Maybe not many books about them yet, but the passion was there. They came out in their Sunday best to go to this thing. And this library became a cultural center, kind of like a church to the people in the Black Belt. Yeah. This one is Charlamagne Hill Rollins, the children's librarian. I'm gonna show you now. You people that work with bosses that frankly kind of get on your nerves. I'm gonna show, this shows you that people don't have to like each other, but they must respect each other and each other's difference. Harsh was called the lieutenant by her staff because she was from that society or class that was standoffish, believed in a gap between you and me, even though she's passionate about the work that she's doing. Charlamagne Hill Rollins came from Mississippi, like Ida B. Wells. And she was a fantastic storyteller, oral storyteller. And she just mentored all the children that came in. Young kids like Gwendolyn Brooks, young men like Langston Hughes. Richard Wright gravitated more toward Vivian G. Harsh, okay? But it was that type of place that fueled their creativity, fueled their energy so that they wanted to come back, they wanted to be a part of something bigger than themselves. Harsh died in 1960, about, I guess, 6 to 9 months after she retired. But Charlemagne Hill Rollins went on to not only work in the Chicago Public Library, but to fight the Chicago Public Library, to fight the American Library Association, to remove the denigrating books that talked about us as Little Black Sambo or as Little Black Pickaninnies off the shelves, got a grant and wrote a curriculum guide called We Build Together, We Build Together, which is really a guide for how you would choose material to sit on the shelf, because her thing was that any child that comes into any library should find something positive that speaks to something to them about themselves. And this is the beautiful George Cleveland Hall Library. You guys, if you get to 48th in Michigan, you gotta just stop and look. It is still so beautiful. I don't know what that material they made it of, but it looks like they just built it a year or so ago. No one would think that it's over 100 years old. Okay. Resources. We have over 5,000 linear feet of material, okay? I'm gonna show you a quick, come on, go back here. This is a record of one of the victims of the 1919 race riot. It would not be obvious reading the finding aid that it was there, but if you come in and look at the funeral records from Kersey, Morse, and McGowan, you would see the records from maybe 1900 to 1950 or 60. This is an image of an evening soiree in the heart of Bronzeville. We see a Fern Gaden, Margaret Burroughs, you see Gwendolyn Brooks, you see Marion Perkins, and you even see a young Vernon Jerry. Okay, so this is what I can offer you guys. I can offer you a lot of resources so you can come in and see material. I did not find much on the 1848 to 1850, but I can guarantee you, if you're looking for voting rights beyond the 1900, my place is the place to come. World War II, Brown versus Board of Education, it's moving slow, not me. Where a lot of the migrants coming to Chicago from the South could not really read, so that frankly Chester Commodore's cartoons, the Chicago Defenders cartoons, told the story. You didn't have to have a book to read what this was saying. This Anvil was breaking the chains of segregation in schools. And as she talked about open housing, the Hansberry decisions opened 500 homes to race. We have that material there. And material on Lorraine Hansberry herself. The West Side, which blew up in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination, and frankly, to some extent, has not ever recovered yet, not like it was before that, because it was a thriving business before the King assassination, but afterwards. And then Chicago Freedom Rally, SNCC, CORE, okay? Women's rights is very much a part of that. Brenda Eichenberger, Sarah White, who is a catfish worker, migrant worker down south, who also wanted their freedoms. And these people all used voting rights as a tactic to get their point across. But voting right was not their main rights. Like I think for the white suffragists, the main aim, it was tunnel vision, was to get the right to vote. For black folks, the main aim was, okay, this is one of the tactics in my arsenal so I can get a better life for my folks. Thank you.
Up and down versus the back and forth. Oh, okay. The notes. Hello. Hey, you see that Beverly and I had the same orange blazer memo. So great minds think alike. But I guess we wanted to bring in the spring for a nice fall winter day. So I am going to talk about the struggle for African American suffragists to be included in today's commemorations, monuments, markers, to bring the history to public spaces today. And so because we already have the history of the struggle for that was during the suffrage movement. I'm going to try to go as fast as I can. I know I have like 10 to 15 minutes. So there's a lot of information that I'm going to try to cram into a very short amount of time. And I actually have my little timer here, so nobody has to scream at me. So, as you already have heard, I am a descendant of Ida B. Wells Barnett. I'm her great-granddaughter. And these are just a few of the things that she did in her life, just that. In addition to that, she was a wife and a mother, which I'm sure those of you who are either or know that also is a job. So she just was a slightly, I guess a slight underachiever for her time. So just so you know how I'm related to her, so that's her, Ida B. Wells Barnett. She had 4 children. So Elfrida Barnett Duster is her youngest daughter. Elfrida had 5 children, and Donald Duster was her middle child, her son, obviously. And then, as for some of you might know some people with the last name Duster, so like, how am I related to who? So Maxine Duster is Donald Duster's wife, my mother, in case you ever heard of Maxine. And then my brothers and I are Donald and Maxine's children. If you know anybody else with the last name Duster, they're either my aunt, uncle, or cousin. Okay, so as you've already heard, there were black suffragists. I just stole this really great picture from Vogue magazine article just to show, because some people have never seen how many black suffragists there were. So I just thought this was a nice way to actually see their faces. And as you've already heard, there was a march in 1913, a suffrage march, and my great-grandmother famously decided to not agree to be put in the back, and she inserted herself in line with her Illinois delegates, who are the people she traveled to the parade with in Washington, D.C. And there's another sort of stock image of the parade, which is what most people tend to see if you Google, suffrage march, you'll see that. Mostly white women. So there you go. My great-grandmother was like, nope, y'all gonna see me, and I'm gonna be right in the front. So just to go through the monuments, and this is what I've been involved in addition to a gazillion other things. But I really feel that it's very important for African Americans in general, African American women in particular, to be seen in public spaces, in public art, because a lot of people don't go to college. And I think it's important for people who don't go to college and don't necessarily study this kind of thing, even if they do go to college, to have access to the information and to be able to stumble upon it when they're just kind of walking around in their ordinary lives, in addition to, obviously, people who do go to college. So this is the thing. So there was a suffrage monument that was created by Adelaide Johnson, and it depicted Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott, who are constantly touted as the mothers of the suffrage movement. And then it was donated to Congress in 1921, and then it was promptly put into a crypt until 1997. And this is what it looks like. And so you have these 3 white women in marble on a pedestal, and then there's one unfinished mound, which I guess represented the future or the unfinished struggle. So what does this do? It tells a story, right, of like, okay, suffragists, white women, on a pedestal, in stone. Where are the black women? Okay, so this is the thing. There's a problem with having information in public spaces that starts with curriculum. And I've seen this argument, and that's why archivists are so important, because if you don't have the information, then people are making these kind of decisions about what's going to be included based on information that they find or that they are taught. So I have found that 3% of the information that are in history text in mostly grammar school only are about women, 3%. Then you have in this country, about 10% of the statues honor women. And then 2% of the national monuments honor women, period. Now, there's only one that represents a black woman, which is Harriet Tubman. So now what's going on with these current efforts, and I looked at all these different cities. These are the ones that I found that are doing the most activity. I'm sure there are others, but these are the ones that I found. So this might take a little bit of time, and we could probably get into more detail during the discussion. But this project that's happening in Central Park in New York City is, I think, going to go down in history as a case study on how do you depict or be inclusive of a movement. So first of all, Central Park doesn't have any real women represented at all out of 23 statues. So these people decided to form a committee and have women represented. They decided to have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony have a monument to Women's Suffrage Movement Monument. That's what it was called. And I was like, huh? How are you going to have a women's suffrage movement monument with only 2 women? And they already have their own statue already. So then they decided this way of being inclusive, this scroll this is the original design, to be inclusive, to have 22 other names of suffragists on it, and 7 of them black women, including Ida B. Wells. So I guess I was supposed to be excited about that. But anyway, that's a long story. I was like, I don't know. That's not really, I don't know if my great-grandmother would really be happy about being listed on a scroll that goes to the ground. So then I wasn't the only one who had a problem with this, and they got a whole lot of pushback, and then they decided to come up with another design which says Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, women's rights pioneers. And I'm like, that's better. But it still has 2 women, and 2 women who've already have their own statue. So they got a lot of pushback about that. And now they came up with a third design, which they have included Sojourner Truth. So, we can talk about this all night, but this is what they're doing in Central Park. Now, there's another woman, another sculptor, who wants to create something that's a little bit more inclusive, multi-generational, multiracial, and her name is Jane Dedecker. She wants to depict Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her daughter Harriet Stanton Blanche, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, and Ida B. Wells. So you can see there's more women, and a couple of them African-American women. This is the design that she's come up with. That's like a little clay model that's on her website of what it will look like. And then the rings around it at the bottom would include more names. And she said that the idea for this design is it looks kind of like a teardrop, and then the water kind of ripples out. And so it sort of represents a lot of stuff. I mean, you know how artists are. So she created a smaller version, and it was installed in Little Rock, Arkansas, and you can see along the base their names of other suffragists. And so my personal opinion is that's a way more inclusive way of telling the story than just to have 3 women. So she wants to create a bigger statue of the same design in Washington, D.C. And she told me this. I've actually met this artist, and she was telling me all these plans, and I was like, really? So you're going to get a congressional act of you're going to get an act of Congress to make this statue, and there's all this stuff involved when you're dealing with federal land. And so she's really moving forward. I think she's going to do it because she's contacted her Congress people, her senators from Colorado, and there's actually been bills, and I've been tracing them. And I'm like, this woman is really serious. I mean, you can probably imagine how many people tell me they're going to do things. And I'm like, because that's kind of the end of it, but she might actually achieve this. So now moving on to Tennessee, which out of the different things I've seen going on around the country, Tennessee is, in my opinion, a case study on what you can do. This state is ironic to me because it was the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment, but it's, to me, the leader when it comes to actually commemorating suffragists for their state. So they have this suffrage trail, which has historical markers, monuments, memorials, plaques, busts, tours, statues, and grave sites. I put the websites on the slides in case you all want more information that I can't talk about in 10 minutes about what's going on with these projects. So just really quickly, I mean, this is from their websites. They have the markers, they have statues, they have busts. They have this whole trail that you can go around the whole state of Tennessee and looking at these information about these suffragists from Tennessee. So they have this, and this is they're way ahead of the game because this is 2006. They created this monument in Knoxville, and it has 3 suffragists on there. You can look at their website to find out more information about who these women were. But also, I thought this was interesting how they have the information on the base of the monument, which is, I mean, to me, that's a way to tell more information than what we saw in some of the other designs that I showed. So then they also created a monument in Nashville, and I highlighted in yellow the African Americans that going forward, because I'm looking to see these monuments that are going around the country, how many women that are not white are actually being honored, because we all know that there were people who were not white who were in this fight. And we cannot today in 2020 have these long-standing public tributes to suffragists that don't tell the whole story. I just think that's very important. So then this is what the monument looks like in Nashville. Now Memphis is creating a monument which is supposed to be installed this coming March, 2 months from now. We'll see, because it was supposed to be last year, so who knows. But again, there's representation of African American women, and they're going to have 6 busts and then 7 other people etched into glass, and this is what it's going to look like. So that's pretty impressive, I think. And I think it's pretty inclusive, 13 people versus 3 versus 2. Now, in Fairfax County, Virginia, you might have heard of the Occoquan Workhouse, which is the prison where suffragists were confined and brutalized, basically, for fighting for the right to vote. Well, on that land, there's a committee that's building a monument, a memorial to suffragists. And this, to me, so far is the most comprehensive thing I've seen going on, because it's going to be like this park-like setting with all these like different stations where people can read about different people, and I don't know, it just seems very extensive. So again, to talk about the dearth of women, period, being represented in public spaces, you have approximately 200 statues in New York City. 150 of them are real people. They actually have statues of dogs, but only 5 women are depicted out of all of these statues. There are 23 statues in Central Park, not one of a real woman. They have, the goddess of victory and all of that kind of allegorical kind of stuff, but no real women, only 5. And then Chicago has about 50 statues of real people, and the only one so far that a statue that is lifelike that you can see what the person looked like is the Gwendolyn Brooks that was just installed in 2018. So then the last thing, there's this effort. So now I think women are starting to pay attention to this, and I think the controversy with the Confederate monuments and all this is kind of bringing this to the surface. Like, where are the women? So now there's an effort in New York City to build 6 statues to women. And again, I've highlighted the African American women. And so this is I can't even call this a statue, I guess a monument that's being created to Shirley Chisholm in Brooklyn. It looks pretty cool. I like how the shadow goes down, so it's what you can think about, what does that symbolize? And so that's what the Gwendolyn Brooks looks like here in Chicago, as you know. And then, here in Chicago, we decided, well, there aren't any statues, so we're going to make some up for a day. With the live statues in Chicago, which happened last year, depicting Jane Addams, Lorraine Hansberry, Lucy Parsons, and Ida B. Wells. And just really quickly to tell you some of the things I've been doing, I'm trying to hit every single way that people can learn about our history. So I've written books. I was involved in getting a street renamed here in Chicago. Thank you. that's important, you know. Streets matter. It was the first, for those of you who aren't sure, the Ida B. Wells Drive is the first street in downtown Chicago ever in the history of the city to be named after a woman, any woman, or any person of color. So she's both, so I guess they got a twofer, and they're like, okay, we're done. And then I've been working forever with a committee to create a monument for Ida B. Wells. Richard Hunt on the right is going to be the sculptor. It's going to be abstract, so I'm sure some people will be mad, but they can just make their own statue if they don't like what I come up with. It's going to be in this plaza area on the land where the Ida B. Wells homes were, in that park-like setting. And then I worked with Alderman King to get a historical marker placed on 37th and King Drive to help people remember that there was an entire community on that land. I think it's important for that to not be erased, and also for the people who lived there for 60 years to have a space where they can come back to and say that they lived there. And then we got the honorary street name too. Last thing, there's an Ida Trek, which is a walk in honor of Ida B. Wells. So this is a way to get families involved, and I joined it 3 years into it, but it's a lot of fun. Bring the kids. It's going to be July 27th this year. And so these are some other things that are underway. There's going to be a marker place for the Alpha Suffrage Club. I just stumbled upon this project that Rockford women are doing to create a monument for Northern suffragists. And then just to last but not least, this to me shows why these spaces are important, because people gravitate to a physical space. And these are pictures of I voted stickers at Susan B. Anthony and Ida B. Wells' gravesite. So if you want to take a picture of this, y'all can take a picture to find more information about all the things that I just talked about. Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody. Now we can have a conversation. Thanks so much again for all of your presentations. This is such a rich subject that all of you have pointed out in different ways has been ignored, undermined, and sort of buried. And so thanks to the three of you for doing all of this incredible work to make this story visible. We had a conversation a few days ago, and one of the things that sparked our conversation a little bit was an article, two articles actually, that were written in the New York Times by the columnist Brett Staples. And they were inspired by the controversy in New York, in which Brett Staples was angered by the fact that all of this attention was being paid to Susan B. Anthony and the other white suffragettes, and no one was talking about the sort of the racism that was inherent in the suffrage movement and the sort of struggles that African American women encountered in the movement. So I wondered if we could sort of talk, if you all have thoughts about that, not only about maybe the way the history has been told, but about the sort of complicated nature of racial politics in women's suffrage. As you've all noted, we have lots of triumphant narratives, but racism was also sort of deeply embedded in that political struggle. So I know I've just given them a whopper of a question, but would anybody like to sort of weigh in or just offer your thoughts about that?
I guess I'm first. I do agree that racism is a part of the suffrage movement. If we even look at the Alpha Suffrage Club that Ida B. Wells started at the turn of the century, she says in some of her articles that it was the first club founded for voting rights for African American women because, one, they were not really welcome in the mainstream suffrage movement, and the Illinois Federation of Colored Women Clubs and the national clubs, when she went to them and talked to them, they weren't really interested in voting rights as itself, as a standalone. along with a bunch of the other things that they was interested maybe, but not just in voting rights. So she started this club, and she printed articles in Half Century magazine and Crisis, because we had people like W.B. Du Bois who was pushing the idea of universal suffrage, okay? So that I think that the suffrage movement became kind of important to the rest of the movement after about the 1870s, after the Illinois got the right to vote, after the black men, African American men were given the right to vote. Now, knowing the backdrop story is that angered a lot of female or women's suffrage, because the men were given the right to vote before they were. And instead of piggybacking on the progress they had made, instead they used that amendment as a scapegoat to splinter off into so many sections that they really hurted themselves, I believe.
Go ahead.
I think the thing that, well, there's many things that I could say, but one thing that comes to mind in the context of the article is that there have been a group of African American women historians and historians of African American women's history who were foundational to recovering this history in the 1990s. And it's very interesting to me, the discovery of this, in that these excellent books by Rosalind Terborg Penn, by Wanda Hendricks, by Beverly Guy Sheftel, there's Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Elsa Barkley Brown, and they've done this very deep research that is hard research. It's very difficult research. It's not, you don't just go to the archive typically. I mean, for those of us who have had access to the Vivian Harsh collection, someone's done the work to put this together, but that was not necessary, that wasn't the case. So my point being is that it's an this isn't direct, I'm not answering your question, I'll be a great politician. It's exciting in this moment that so many people are discovering this, and I would encourage folks to buy. I was just looking at Rosalind Terborg Penn's book the other day, and I was blown away again by how, I mean, I remember that it was a dissertation for a long time that wasn't published. And I remember back in the 90s, you used to have to order it just to even see it. And it was just, you just happened to know somebody who knew that there was a dissertation on African American women suffragists. And this also points to kind of the way that publishing and institutions, and this gets, I think, to some of your points about the public presence of these histories. And I think that's what was interesting about that article, is that it brought to a large audience a history that's pretty well known from some of this research, and is still being done. There are people who are writing new and important books. There's all kinds of research out there. But that was one of the things that was most interesting to me. So get a copy of these books. Did you want to say something?
Do we have to?
Okay. Cool. Oh, do we have to do that?
No, I don't want to. So, I mean, we're all working in different sort of arenas, and I can only speak to what I'm doing and the kind of comments and experiences comments that I'm hearing and experiences that I'm having. And one of the things that I found interesting, two things. One is I have had people, specifically white women, try to minimize, to me, the actual racism that my ancestor actually experienced. You know, this sort of apologizing and sort of glossing over the actual, exclusion and marginalization that actually occurred, and trying to make it seem like, the usual, like, oh, well, you're just too sensitive. Oh, you're taking it the wrong way. And I'm like, no, there was racism. Let's just be honest about it. And that is a problem, because when you're trying to create something in order to correct an erasure, but then people don't want to acknowledge the erasure in the first place, then it's almost like you're battling two battles, because you're trying to help people understand an actual reality. And one of the things that I found when I'm talking with Black women, and I'm on Twitter and I see all these comments, and some of these people I don't know. These are people that are like in the virtual world saying stuff to me. So what I found is that there is an attitude from, I think, mostly younger women, Black women, that are like, well, the suffrage movement, that doesn't matter to me. What does it matter? I mean, Black women didn't get the right to vote anyway. Like, how are we included? I'm just saying, these are some of the comments. And so this attitude that I have seen some younger Black women say that, that was a white woman's thing. And so I think, and that's why I feel very strongly, we have to help people understand, no, it was not a white woman's thing. Black women were there. They were there from the beginning, but they were just written out of the history. And so we today have to write people into the history, not write them back into history, write them into the history to begin with, because there is a generation, or there's a perception that Black women weren't there. And one other thing I'll just say is that I've written a couple of articles about this sort of continuum of the marginalization of Black women in these, quote, women's movements, from the suffrage movement all the way to the Women's March. And there's this attitude among a lot of Black women that, that's a white woman's thing. They don't even care about Black women's issues. So there's just a lot going on when you're talking about these type of issues.
I think also the language itself. Suffrage is such, I want to say, an old word. And I think if they would bring it into modern day language, maybe voting would be the better way to go. The problem is not only young women's view of the word today, which is not frankly used except frankly in the women's suffrage movement, which is the centennial that we're celebrating. I don't want to say celebrating, but you know what I'm saying. It's acknowledging. Thank you. Thanks. The history of the women's suffrage movement in the United States did not have any Black women in it, from what I could see, the first original version, with maybe the exception of Sojourner Truth. A part of me is a little kind of frustrated, I guess I would say, that Sojourner Truth is the only Black woman that they chose to acknowledge. And frankly, part of that is because she was such a powerhouse. She had been through so much. She had no fear, and she refused to be ignored. A lot of the Black women at that time did not have that luxury. And a lot of the African American suffragists that you all are talking about are in a cluster, I've noticed, around New York City, Washington, D.C., Maryland, or Frederick Douglass, okay? Right. We're talking about people who, frankly, were not slaves, who were educated. Some of the children were freeborn, like the Fortin family or the Grimke, and frankly, they were mentored by Frederick Douglass, who was really a strong proponent of abolition. And these movements in the North grew out of the abolitionist movement. And to me, it makes sense that if you got education, if you got a job, and if you don't have the fear of being lynched or being thrown out your home, the next level to you look for is betterment, and you see the next step, that your neighbors, who are mostly white, is voting. And I think they frankly ignored 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of the Black women in the United States who did not have any of that.
I want to make sure we have time to hear from you all, to answer some of your questions, to respond to some of your thoughts. So why don't we open this up to the audience? Yes.
Hi, I'm Kiana. So I wanted to ask you, basically, if you guys had any knowledge on where other races of women stood in it, because, I feel like I had to do a lot of outside research just for Black women in itself, and then I never hear about like Hispanic women, Asian women, or just like other immigrants that have come and have like participated in the movement. So do you guys have any like knowledge you could share with us about them too?
Just quickly, I'm going to repeat the question for the camera, and it's whether or not anyone has knowledge about other women who were advocates for voting rights. We'll use voting rights rather than suffrage, particularly from other marginalized groups, racialized groups, immigrant groups.
I know just a little bit. I know, well, one of the things that people, that I've understand that influenced Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott in particular, when it came to having this meeting in Seneca Falls, was the Seneca Nation of Native Americans. The Seneca Nation was located in New York State, and that was more of a matriarchal kind of society. Women had a lot of rights in the Seneca Nation, and that kind of influenced Lucretia Mott's idea. I'm like, wow, the way that our patriarchal society is set up is not the only way it has to be. So that's what I understand, that it sort of sparked a little bit when it came to that. And the Seneca Nation does not get very much credit for what influenced the conference in Seneca Falls. The other thing is that Native American women, from what I understand, got the right to vote supposedly, I guess on paper, in 1924. So 4 years after the amendment. But then I was just talking to a Native American woman a couple of weeks ago, and she was like, well, that was on paper the same way it was for Black women. But it really, there's still like technically, voter suppression. So one could argue there hasn't been full suffrage at this point. And then, of course, African American women, the voting rights of 1965, but also the Asian women. I think it was 1954 when they were considered citizens. So this whole thing is about like what is citizenship, and when do you become a citizen? And actually, there was a difference between Chinese women and Japanese women. I can't remember the exact dates, but it was in the 1950s.
And as an archivist, we're moving back to the point of the record keeper. Where are the records? Native Americans, by their very nature, are oral history tradition. And they're also kind of closed in that they're starting slowly to move forward. I'm not going to say into the 20th century, but to realize that they need to have some kind of written record, or so that future generations can know what happened. A lot of things went on, and they probably were a part of the suffrage, the voting movement. But it's mostly oral history. It's very hard to find records, and then it's very hard for people who are not of Native American tradition to go in there and talk to them and get their stories. They may give it to each other, but they don't give it to us. I know that they're starting to create their own museums and their own visual places that give credit and visibility to the work that they've been doing.
So let me build on some of these excellent points, starting with your point about Asian American women and citizenship. So much of what this 19th Amendment moment is, I think, is an opportunity across the United States for people to really think very seriously about citizenship, what it means. There's gradations of citizenship. Citizenship doesn't, unfortunately, it's supposed to guarantee things, but you can look at the history of African Americans in this country, and citizenship is, there are gradations of citizenship. And in the case of, so there were women of color in the suffrage movement, in the the NASA, the League of Women Voters, the kind of the alphabet soup that I projected earlier. And when we think about this, there were women who were ineligible, and this is what you were referring to, is that women were ineligible, Chinese American women, for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. All Chinese immigrants, that is, many generations, were ineligible for citizenship. So it is a challenge to be part of a movement for which you are not even on the table for suffrage. The same can be said, and you can start to kind of move around this idea of voting rights and citizenship. If you think about the case of Puerto Rico, all you have to do is ask Puerto Ricans if citizenship guarantees anything. And though they can give you, you can read the news. In the case of Puerto Rico, there were many who didn't seek to be U.S. citizens. And so the idea of being involved in the women's suffrage movement, of greater incorporation into the United States for those who sought independence, wasn't the case. The flip side was, and is, just to sit, I can move around from different places, but you can see I think the possibilities of really thinking through what citizenship has meant in voting, inclusion, exclusion in this country. In the case of Puerto Rico, once again, when the 19th Amendment passed, Puerto Ricans who are full U.S. citizens since 1917, those women were not enfranchised. They're full U.S. citizens. They were not enfranchised. They are not enfranchised today. They're colonial subjects. They're colonial citizens. They're enfranchised on the island, on the archipelago, but they don't vote for president. They don't vote for vice president. They don't have a congressional representation that they vote for. And so, I don't know if that's a direct answer to your question, but there were women involved. And I would also do a shout out. Kathleen Cahill is going to be coming out with a book soon that is going to be telling these histories. Many other examples, but let me just stop there. But keep looking. There's a lot there, and we have so many opportunities, and keep an eye out for that book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Yes, please, go ahead.
As a native Chicagoan of a certain age, I had Afro-American history in my house every day, because my mother was an educator. I'm wondering now, in 2020, are any Chicago public school elementary students or even high school students learning any of this information in regard to 19th Amendment, in regard to suffragist movement, in regard to African American history?
Just to repeat the question, we're being asked if elementary school, secondary school students in the city of Chicago, perhaps in the entire state of Illinois, are they being taught, are they learning anything about this history of suffrage and African Americans' role in this movement and in other movements?
I don't know that it's a part of the day-to-day or month-to-month curriculum in the Chicago public schools, but I do know that libraries and dedicated teachers are doing their part by putting the stories out there. I know that Lisa, who's here, was a part of the Metro History Fair for years, and they had an ongoing grant where they would bring not only students from the Chicago area and the suburban area into not just Harsh, but other manuscript repositories around Chicago to teach them how to look at primary source material, how to look at histories. But they also had a grant where they would bring in teachers from the Midwest to teach them about history, because it's kind of hard to teach something that you yourself don't know. So a lot of teachers would come into the collection, and I think it was a 2-week or maybe 3-week program where we would bring out manuscript material and show them how to utilize this material in their curriculum. And I have noticed that a lot more younger students are coming to the libraries for Metro History Fair with, frankly, challenging but interesting topics. You know, it's interesting to them It may not be interesting to us. They look at history as with such a different lens than we do. But I think that it is on us as people who kind of live this history and who's preserving it for the future to give them a chance to see where their mindset and where the story is taking them.
If I can just interject and add something to that, as many of you know, the state of Illinois passed legislation last year that mandates the teaching of African American history or Black history in secondary schools, in public schools. But I think the critical issue is who's going to teach it and what the knowledge is. So I have to make a plug for my field in African American studies. At the college level, that's what we do. And it's very difficult sometimes to convince students that they should be taking these classes because we have to continue this legacy. But I think it's very much a trickle-down effect that we've got to train teachers. Thank goodness for the librarians. Thank goodness for the parents and the families and the community organizations that are doing that work. Also the public monuments and the public history work of organizations like yours. I think we have time for one last question.
Yes, ma'am. So piggybacking off that, I teach Chicago History Team program. We just started at the high school level. It's a semester class, predominantly African American students who know nothing about their history. And I was wondering what kind of sources would you suggest should be of the utmost importance regarding the 19th Amendment and this whole program? Like if you had one takeaway, each of you, what would it be?
That's an awesome question. Thank you. It's such a great way to round this out. So to repeat the question, if we're committed to teaching this history, what are the resources that you would recommend bringing into the classroom?
From my collection, the Illinois Writers Project, even though it's a 1942 vehicle, it built on the previous generation's history, so that while I did not find a lot, but it wasn't indexed like we would index today, of information on voting right, there were about 2 boxes, probably the same 2 boxes you looked in, that had a lot of information on African American politics in Illinois. And while they don't mention suffrage or voting, if you think critically, you see that that was an issue there. So I think material like that would be so much better than a secondary book that we've written about the subject so that they could see firsthand. And the newspapers. People laugh at the newspaper. They say, who reads the news today? We have it on our little phone. But the newspapers from the 19th century and early 20th century, especially the Chicago Defender, tell a wonderful story and give a lot of information, probably more than you can find in the books that are on the shelves of the library or the disappearing books from the shelves of the libraries today.
What a challenging question. I'm just thinking through all the potential sources, and I think it is worthwhile to use the recent newspaper articles that have come out about the anniversary of the commemoration of the 19th Amendment. Many of the things that you were speaking about, these students are interested in the politics of this history, and I think the politics of this history it makes me, and I imagine it would other people, want to know more, and that provides an opportunity to spark to then go into the archives, go into the sources, read the secondary literature. There are superb books. Rosalind Terborg Penn, very readable as one potential, and others. I think that this conversation of the 19th Amendment itself and problematizing it in some of the same ways that the questions have been asked today, were there other women, even saying that, there weren't people showing up this way, or the language, that in and of itself, I think that's what's exciting about this moment. less, not a celebration per se, but rather a national possibility to really think about difficult histories and difficult nows.
Well, as I've already established, I'm sort of more kind of focused on the public history aspect, and unfortunately, there was a really good exhibit at the National Portrait Gallery that just closed, but it was called Votes for Women, and there was a companion book that was made for that exhibit, and it is available on Amazon, called Votes for Women is the name of the book. It has a lot of the history that has been undertold. And most of the people who contributed to the book are some of the scholars that were mentioned here. And the other thing is, I mean, because most of the people are on the website, the website for the Turning Point Suffrage Memorial is suffragistmemorial.org, SUFFRAGIST, memorial.org. That is a very extensive website. And for students, they might kind of get lost in it because you can click on all these hyperlinks and go all over the place. I mean, they can probably spend hours, and then it might take them into other kinds of information and build their curiosity. So those are the two sources that I have seen that probably have the most comprehensive information in one place. That would be a starting point to kind of pique their interest.
Well, I think we've run out of time, and I want to take this opportunity to thank our wonderful panel. Will everybody give them a round of applause? Thank you so much.